The rain had stopped by the time they lowered Thomas into the ground, but Zara Sullivan stood at the graveside long after the last mourner had walked away, her black dress heavy with mud at the hem, and her heart heavier still with the weight of what came next. She was 23 years old and had been married for barely 14 months before influenza had stolen her husband from her in the cruel spring of 1883, and now she faced the prospect of being cast out by the only family she had left in this unforgiving world. The cemetery outside Kingston, Nevada sat on a wind-swept hill where sagebrush grew between the weathered markers, and the mountains in the distance seemed to mock her with their permanence, while everything she had known crumbled like dried earth between her fingers. Walter Sullivan had made his intentions clear the moment his son had drawn his last rattling breath. The old man had looked at Zara with eyes like chips of flint and told her that she had 1 week after the funeral to gather her things and leave his property. No amount of pleading had moved him. No reminder that she had nursed Thomas through those final terrible days, sitting by his bedside and spooning broth between his cracked lips even when the fever made him delirious, and he no longer recognized her face. Walter had built his ranch with his own 2 hands over 30 hard years, and he would be damned if any part of it went to a woman who had failed to give him a grandson before his son died. That was how he saw it, cold and simple as mathematics, and nothing Zara said could penetrate the wall of grief and bitterness that had turned his heart to stone. She walked back to the ranch house as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. The house sat squat and solid against the landscape, built from timber hauled all the way from California and stones pulled from the earth by Walter's own hands. She had thought it would be her home forever when Thomas had carried her across the threshold, his laugh warm and his arms strong around her. Now it felt like a prison from which she was about to be expelled into a world that had no place for a woman alone. The wake had been held in the parlor, and the neighbors had brought casseroles and pies and murmured their condolences before filtering away as the afternoon wore on. Zara had stood beside Walter and accepted their sympathy with a numb smile, her face aching from holding the expression for so many hours. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring property had squeezed her hand and told her that if she ever needed anything at all, she should not hesitate to ask. But Zara knew how these things worked in small frontier towns. Charity extended only so far, and a young widow with no family and no prospects was more burden than most could bear. That evening, after the last guest had departed, and the house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, Walter called her into his study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, and the walls were lined with books that Thomas had loved to read on winter evenings while the wind howled outside. Walter sat behind his heavy desk, his face haggard in the lamplight, and gestured for her to take the chair across from him. "I will give you $50, he said without preamble. "That is more than generous, considering you brought nothing to this marriage but a pretty face and good manners." Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Thomas loved me, and I loved him. That should count for something." "Love does not pay debts or mend fences or put food on the table," Walter replied, his tone hard. "You are young enough to find work in town, or perhaps another husband if you are fortunate. But you cannot stay here. I have already made arrangements to hire a housekeeper, a widow with grown children who knows how to run a household properly." "I ran this household properly for over a year," Zara protested, her hands clenched in her lap. "I cooked and cleaned and mended and tended the garden. I did everything you asked and more. And yet my son is dead, and there is no grandchild to carry on the Sullivan name." Walter's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and for a moment Zara saw the grief beneath his anger, raw and terrible. But then his jaw tightened, and the moment passed. "You will leave on Saturday morning. That gives you 4 days to pack your belongings. The $50 should be enough to secure a room in town and see you through until you find employment." Zara wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the injustice of being cast out like a hired hand whose services were no longer required, but she could see in Walter's face that his mind was set, and she knew from bitter experience that he was a man who never went back on a decision once made. So she rose from the chair with as much dignity as she could muster, thanked him stiffly for the $50, and went upstairs to the bedroom that had been hers and Thomas's. She sat on the edge of the bed they had shared and let the tears come at last, hot and fierce and uncontrollable. She wept for Thomas, for the future they had planned together, for the children they would never have. She wept for herself, for the uncertainty that lay ahead and the fear that gnawed at her like a hungry animal. And she wept for the unfairness of a world that could take everything from a person and leave them with nothing but grief and $50 in silver coins. The next 3 days passed in a blur of packing and quiet desperation. Zara folded her dresses and packed them in the small trunk that had belonged to her mother, now long dead. She wrapped the few pieces of jewelry Thomas had given her in scraps of cloth and tucked them carefully among her clothes. She took the photograph of their wedding day, the two of them standing stiff and solemn before the camera, and slipped it between the pages of her Bible. Everything else, all the household goods and furniture and small comforts she had accumulated during her marriage, belonged to Walter and would stay with the ranch. On Friday evening, Mrs. Henderson rode over with her eldest son driving the wagon. She had heard through the intricate network of ranch wives and townswomen that Zara was being turned out, and her face was tight with disapproval as she climbed down from the wagon seat. "This is a shameful business, Dr. she said to Walter, who had come out onto the porch when he heard the wagon approach. "That girl is family, and you are casting her out like a stray dog." "How I manage my household is my own concern," Walter replied coldly. "I suggest you mind your own affairs, Margaret." "When a woman is left destitute through no fault of her own, it becomes everyone's affair," Mrs. Henderson shot back. She turned to Zara, who stood in the doorway with her trunk at her feet. "I have come to offer you a ride into town tomorrow morning. My son will load your trunk, and you can stay with us tonight if you wish to be away from this place sooner." Zara felt a rush of gratitude so powerful it nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Thank you, but I have already arranged to take the ranch wagon in the morning. Walter has agreed to let me use it one last time." Mrs. Henderson looked as though she wanted to say more, but she simply nodded and pressed a small cloth bag into Zara's hands. "Some bread and cheese for your journey. And if you need a place to stay, you come to me, you hear? We have a spare room, and you are welcome to it for as long as you need." "You're very kind," Zara managed to say, her throat tight. "I will remember that." After Mrs. Henderson left, Zara returned to her room and lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the morning. She had decided to take a room at the boarding house in Kingston, at least until she could find some kind of work. There was a dress shop in town that might need a seamstress, and the hotel sometimes hired girls to work in the kitchen or laundry. She had no particular skills beyond the ordinary accomplishments of a rancher's wife, but she was willing to work hard, and surely that would count for something. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the high desert air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Zara dressed carefully in her traveling clothes, a dark blue dress with a high collar and a wool coat that had been Thomas's before he grew too broad in the shoulders for it. She pinned her dark hair up under a plain bonnet and took one last look around the bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the surfaces dusted, everything left in perfect order, as though she had never been there at all. Walter was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, drinking coffee and staring out the window at the lightening sky. He did not look at her as she entered, and she did not speak to him. There seemed to be nothing left to say. She took the $50 he had left on the table, the coins wrapped in a piece of brown paper, and slipped them into her reticule. Then she went outside to where one of the ranch hands had hitched the wagon and loaded her trunk into the back. The ride into Kingston took nearly 2 hours along the rutted dirt road that wound through the sagebrush and scrub. Zara sat on the wagon seat with the reins slack in her hands, letting the horses set their own pace. The land spread out around her in all directions, vast and empty and beautiful in its harshness. She had grown to love this country during her time with Thomas. The way the light changed throughout the day, the distant purple mountains, the smell of sage after rain. Now she looked at it with the eyes of an exile, knowing she might never see it quite this way again. Kingston was a small town that had sprung up around the silver mines in the hills, though the richest veins had already been played out and the population had dwindled from its peak. Main Street ran straight as an arrow through the center of town, lined with false-fronted buildings that housed a general store, a saloon, a bank, a telegraph office, a doctor's surgery, and a handful of other establishments. The boarding house sat at the north end of town, a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and faded paint. Zara drove the wagon to the front and climbed down, her legs stiff from the long ride. She was reaching for her trunk when a voice behind her made her turn. "That looks heavy. Let me help you with that." The man who spoke was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of wheat that fell across his forehead under a battered hat. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, denim trousers and a chambray shirt with a leather vest, and his boots were scuffed from hard use. But it was his eyes that caught Zara's attention, a clear gray-green that looked at her with such straightforward kindness that she felt something in her chest loosen just a fraction. "I can manage," she said automatically, because that was what a woman alone learned to say. "I am sure you can," he replied with a slight smile. "But there is no reason you should have to when I'm standing right here with nothing better to do." He stepped up to the wagon and lifted her trunk, as though it weighed nothing at all, settling it easily on his shoulder. "Where are you taking this?" "The boarding house," Zara said, gesturing at the building. "I am hoping they have a room available." "Mrs. Cooper runs a decent place," the man said. "Clean sheets and hot meals, and she does not tolerate any nonsense from her boarders." He carried the trunk up the steps and set it down on the porch, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both respectful and friendly. "Welcome to Kingston, Miss." "Mrs. Sullivan," Zara corrected gently. "I am recently widowed." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of sympathy that did not slide into pity. "I am sorry for your loss. My name is Gabriel Zimmerman. Most folks just call me Gabe. I work at the Rocking M Ranch, about 10 miles west of here." "Thank you for your help, Mr. Zimmerman," Zara said, and meant it. "Just Gabe, please." He paused, seeming to consider something, then added, "If you need anything while you're getting settled, the Rocking M is not hard to find. Just follow the main road west until you see the sign. My boss, Mr. McKenna, is a fair man, and I like to think I am too. We help our neighbors when we can." Before Zara could respond, the door of the boarding house opened, and a stout woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense expression appeared. "Gabe Zimmerman, are you bothering my new guest?" "Just offering to carry her trunk, Mrs. Cooper," Gabe said with an easy grin. "You know I would never bother a lady." Mrs. Cooper looked unconvinced, but her expression softened when she turned to Zara. "Are you looking for a room, dear?" "Yes, if you have one available," Zara replied. "I can pay in advance for the first week." "Come inside and we will discuss terms," Mrs. Cooper said. She glanced at Gabe. "You can bring that trunk in since you are already here. Put it in the room at the top of the stairs." Gabe did as he was told, and Zara followed Mrs. Cooper into the dim interior of the boarding house. The front hall smelled of lye soap and something baking, and the wooden floors creaked under her feet. Mrs. Cooper led her into a small parlor and gestured for her to sit. "Rooms are $2 a week, meals included," Mrs. Cooper said briskly. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, and you are on your own for the midday meal, though I usually have bread and cold meat available if you are here. No men in the rooms, no drinking, and no loud noises after 9 o'clock. Laundry is extra, 50 cents a week. Do those terms suit you?" "Yes, they do," Zara said, relief washing over her. $2 a week would stretch her $50 quite far if she was careful, and it would give her time to find work. "Good." Mrs. Cooper's expression softened. "I heard about your husband, dear. Thomas Sullivan, was it not? I knew his father some years back before he got so hard and bitter. I'm sorry for your loss, and I am sorry Walter turned you out. That was a cruel thing to do." Zara swallowed against the sudden lump in her throat. "Thank you." "You will do fine here," Mrs. Cooper said firmly. "You have a good face, honest and strong. This town could use more women like you." She stood and held out her hand. "Now let me show you to your room, and then you can get settled. If you need anything, I'm usually in the kitchen or the parlor." The room at the top of the stairs was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a single window that looked out over Main Street. Gabe had left her trunk at the foot of the bed, and Zara stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. It was nothing like the spacious bedroom she had shared with Thomas, but it was hers, at least for now, and that was something. She spent the rest of the day unpacking her few belongings and trying to make the room feel less bare. She hung her dresses in the wardrobe and set her brush and comb on the washstand. She placed the photograph of Thomas on the small table beside the bed, angling it so she could see his face when she lay down. By the time the dinner bell rang at 6 o'clock, she had done all she could to settle in, and her stomach was growling with hunger. The dining room was on the first floor, a long, narrow space with a table that could seat a dozen people. There were only 5 boarders besides Zara, all men who worked in town or at nearby ranches. They nodded politely to her as she took her seat, but conversation was sparse and focused mainly on the food, which was plentiful and well cooked. Mrs. Cooper served roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, and there was apple pie for dessert. Zara ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, her mind already turning to the question of what she would do next. The following days fell into a pattern. Zara spent her mornings walking through town, stopping at every shop and business to ask about work. The dress shop had no openings, and neither did the general store. The hotel manager looked her over with an assessing eye and said he might have something in a week or 2, but he could not promise anything. The doctor needed a nurse to assist with his patients, but he wanted someone with experience, and Zara had to admit she had none beyond the basic care she had given Thomas during his illness. By the end of the week, her initial optimism had begun to fray. She had spent some of her precious dollars on small necessities, and she was painfully aware of how quickly her money would run out if she did not find a source of income soon. The other boarders were polite but distant, and she felt the loneliness of her situation settle over her like a heavy blanket. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after her arrival in Kingston, that everything changed. Zara had spent the morning at the general store helping the owner's wife sort through a shipment of fabric in exchange for a small credit toward future purchases. It was not real work, but it was something, and she was grateful for the distraction. She was walking back to the boarding house when she heard raised voices coming from the alley behind the saloon. She should have kept walking. A woman alone had no business involving herself in the affairs of men, especially when those affairs seemed to involve anger and possibly violence. But something made her pause at the mouth of the alley, and what she saw made her blood run cold. 2 men had a third man cornered against the wall. The one being cornered was Gabe Zimmerman, and even from where she stood, Zara could see the tension in his body, the way his hands were held loose and ready at his sides. The other 2 men were rough-looking, with the hard faces and harder eyes of those who made their living on the wrong side of the law. "We will ask you one more time, Cowboy," the larger of the 2 men said, his voice thick with menace. "Where is McKenna keeping his money? We know he does not trust the bank, so he must have it at the ranch." "And I will tell you one more time," Gabe replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I do not know what you are talking about, and even if I did, I would not tell you. Now step aside and let me pass." The smaller man laughed, a sound without humor. "You think you are tough, do you? Maybe we need to teach you some manners." He reached for Gabe, and that was when Zara acted without thinking. She stepped into the alley and called out in her clearest, most carrying voice, "Mr. Zimmerman, there you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." All 3 men turned to stare at her, and for a moment nobody moved. Then Gabe's eyes met hers, and she saw understanding flash in their gray-green depths. He straightened and gave her a slight nod. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his tone perfectly even, "I apologize for keeping you waiting. I was just having a conversation with these gentlemen." "Well, your conversation will have to wait," Zara said, walking toward them with far more confidence than she felt. "Mrs. Cooper needs your help with something at the boarding house, and she said it could not wait." She looked at the 2 rough men with what she hoped was a pleasant, unconcerned expression. I am sure you gentlemen will excuse him." The larger man scowled, but the smaller one was already backing away, clearly unwilling to cause trouble in front of a witness. "This is not over, Zimmerman," he muttered. "I expect it is," Gabe replied quietly, "unless you want Sheriff Davis to hear about how you two were threatening a man in an alley." The two men exchanged a glance, then turned and walked away quickly, disappearing around the corner. Zara felt her knees go weak with relief, and she had to lean against the wall for a moment to steady herself. Gabe was beside her in an instant, his hand on her elbow to support her. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Zara said, her voice shaking slightly. "I am sorry, I should not have interfered, but I could not just walk away when it looked like they might hurt you." "You might have just saved me from a very unpleasant afternoon," Gabe said seriously. "Those two are known troublemakers, and they have been sniffing around asking questions about the Rocking M for weeks now. My boss thinks they are planning to rob the ranch, but we have not been able to prove anything." He studied her face with concern. "That was a brave thing you did, but also very foolish. They might have turned on you." "I did not think about that," Zara admitted. "I just acted." "Brave and foolish often go hand in hand," Gabe said with a slight smile. "Well, come on, let me walk you back to the boarding house. I want to make sure you get there safely." They walked together through the streets of Kingston, and Zara found herself relaxing in Gabe's presence. There was something steady and reassuring about him, a quiet strength that did not need to announce itself. He asked about how she was settling in, and she told him about her unsuccessful search for work. "I have some money saved, but it will not last forever," she said. "I need to find something soon, or I will have to leave Kingston and try my luck elsewhere." Gabe was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "The Rocking M could use someone to help with the cooking and cleaning. Our regular housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, broke her leg last month and had to go stay with her daughter in California until she heals. Mr. McKenna has been making do with help from some of the ranch hands, but it is not the same. The cooking is terrible, and the house is in chaos." He glanced at her. "If you are interested, I could speak to him about hiring you. The pay is not much, but it includes room and board, and it would be steady work." Zara felt hope flare in her chest, bright and fierce. "Do you really think he would hire me?" "I know he would, especially if I told him how you helped me today," Gabe said. "Mr. McKenna values loyalty and courage, and you showed both. Let me ride out to the ranch and talk to him tonight. If you come out tomorrow afternoon, I'm sure we can work something out." "Thank you," Zara said, her voice thick with emotion. "You do not know what this means to me." "I think I have some idea," Gabe replied gently. "I know what it is like to be alone in the world with nowhere to go. Someone helped me once when I needed it, and I'm just passing that kindness along." They had reached the boarding house, and Gabe touched his hat in farewell. "I will see you tomorrow, Mrs. Sullivan. Come around noon, and we will have everything arranged." That night, Zara lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She hardly dared to believe that her luck might be turning, that she might have found a way forward after all. She thought about Gabe, about the kindness in his eyes and the way he had not questioned her right to help him, even when it might have put her in danger. She thought about the Rockingham Ranch, which she had never seen, and wondered what it would be like to work there. Most of all, she thought about the future, which suddenly seemed a little less dark and uncertain than it had just a few hours before. The next morning she rose early and dressed in her best day dress, a simple gray cotton with white trim at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her hair up carefully and checked her reflection in the small mirror over the washstand. She looked pale and nervous, but her eyes were bright with hope, and that would have to be enough. She told Mrs. Cooper where she was going, and the older woman nodded approvingly. "The Rocking M is a good outfit, and I've heard nothing but good things about McKenna. If they offer you a position, you should take it. You'll be better off there than trying to scrape by in town." Zara walked to the livery stable and arranged to rent a horse and saddle for the afternoon. The stableman, a grizzled man with kind eyes, helped her mount and gave her directions to the ranch. The ride west out of Kingston took her through open country dotted with sagebrush and juniper, the mountains rising in the distance like a wall against the sky. The air was clean and sharp. And despite her nervousness, Zara felt a sense of peace settle over her as she rode. The rocking M Ranch appeared gradually on the horizon, a collection of buildings nestled in a shallow valley with a creek running through it. There was a large ranch house built of logs and stone, a barn, several outbuildings, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Cattle grazed in the distance, and the whole place had an air of prosperous industry that spoke well of its management. Gabe was waiting for her near the barn, and his face lit up when he saw her riding in. He came forward to help her dismount, then led her horse to a hitching post. "Mr. McKenna is in the house," he said. "I told him about you, and he is eager to meet you. Do not be nervous. He is a good man, and he knows you saved me from trouble yesterday." "You told him about that?" Zara asked, surprised. "Of course I did. It speaks to your character, and that matters more than experience when it comes to working on a ranch." Gabe smiled at her. "Come on, I will introduce you." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable, with sturdy furniture and colorful woven rugs on the floors. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace at one end and a long wooden table in the center. A man stood at the table studying what looked like account books, and he looked up when Gabe and Zara entered. "Mr. McKenna, this is Mrs. Zara Sullivan," Gabe said. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is my employer, Patrick McKenna." Patrick McKenna was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent working under the sun. His eyes were sharp and assessing, but not unkind, and when he shook Zara's hand, his grip was firm and respectful. "Gabe tells me you helped him out of a difficult situation yesterday," McKenna said without preamble. "That took courage, Mrs. Sullivan. We could use someone with courage on this ranch." "I did what anyone would have done," Zara replied, trying not to sound as nervous as she felt. "Not anyone," McKenna corrected gently. "Most people would have walked past and pretended they saw nothing. You chose to get involved, and that says something about you." He gestured for her to sit at the table. "Gabe also tells me you are looking for work. As it happens, I'm in desperate need of someone to manage this household. My housekeeper broke her leg and had to leave, and things have gone downhill fast without her. The cooking is barely edible. The place is a mess, and I'm tired of eating beans and burnt biscuits." Despite her nervousness, Zara felt a smile tug at her lips. "I can cook, and I can keep a house clean. I managed my late husband's household for over a year." "Then you are hired if you want the job," McKenna said simply. "The pay is $20 a month, plus room and board. You will have your own room in the house, and you will take your meals with me in the hands. The work is not easy, and the hours can be long, but I promise you will be treated with respect and fairness. Does that sound acceptable?" Zara could hardly believe what she was hearing. $20 a month was more than she had dared hope for, and room and board besides. "Yes," she said, her voice catching. "Yes, that sounds more than acceptable. Thank you, Mr. McKenna." "No need to thank me. You are doing me the favor." McKenna smiled, and his whole face transformed, becoming warm and approachable. "When can you start?" "As soon as you need me," Zara said. "I'm staying at the boarding house in Kingston, but I can pack my things and be back here by tomorrow if that suits you." "Tomorrow is perfect. Gabe can drive you back to town in the wagon and help you collect your belongings." McKenna stood and offered his hand again. "Welcome to the Rocking M, Mrs. Sullivan. I think you're going to fit in just fine." The ride back to Kingston passed in a blur. Zara sat beside Gabe on the wagon seat, her mind reeling with the sudden change in her fortunes. Just yesterday, she had been facing an uncertain future with dwindling funds and no prospects. Now she had a job, a place to live, and the promise of a fresh start. "Thank you," she said to Gabe as the town came into view, "for everything. For helping me that first day, and for thinking of me when Mr. McKenna needed someone, and for believing I could do this." "You do not need to thank me," Gabe said, his eyes on the road ahead. "I have a feeling you would have found your way somehow. You are stronger than you think, Zara Sullivan." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent a small, unexpected warmth through her chest. She told herself it was just gratitude, just relief at having found work and security. But a small part of her, a part she was not quite ready to acknowledge, recognized it for what it really was. The first stirring of something that might, given time and care, grow into something more. The next morning, Gabe arrived at the boarding house with the wagon as promised. Zara had already said her goodbyes to Mrs. Cooper, who had hugged her and told her to come visit whenever she was in town. Her trunk was packed and ready, and within an hour they were on the road back to the Rocking M. The ride was pleasant, the spring sun warm on their faces, and the desert alive with wildflowers that had bloomed after the recent rains. Gabe told her about life on the ranch, about the rhythms of cattle ranching and the cast of characters who worked there. There was old Tom, the foreman, who had been with McKenna since the beginning. There was Billy, barely 18 and still learning the ropes, who had a gift with horses. There was Juan and Carlos, brothers from Mexico, who could rope and brand faster than anyone Gabe had ever seen. "We are like a family," Gabe said. "We look out for each other, and we work hard together. You will find your place among us, I promise." Zara hoped he was right. She had been part of a family once with Thomas, and the loss of that still ached like a fresh wound. But perhaps here, among these people she had not yet met, she could find something to fill the emptiness that had opened up inside her. Her room at the ranch house was larger than her room at the boarding house had been, with a real bed covered in a colorful quilt and a window that looked out over the valley. There was a wardrobe for her clothes and a washstand with a pretty blue pitcher and basin. Gabe carried her trunk in and set it at the foot of the bed, then stood awkwardly in the doorway as though unsure what to say. "If you need anything, my bunk is in the bunkhouse with the other hands," he said finally. "But I am usually around during the day working with the horses or mending tack. Just call if you need help with something." "I will," Zara said. "Thank you, Gabe, for everything." He smiled, that slow, warm smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. And then he was gone, his boots thudding on the wooden floor as he made his way outside. Zara unpacked her trunk and took stock of her new domain. The kitchen was indeed in need of attention, with dirty dishes piled in the wash basin and the floor in need of sweeping. But the pantry was well stocked with staples, and there was a good supply of firewood stacked by the stove. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, scrubbing and sweeping and organizing until the kitchen gleamed. By the time the hands came in for the evening meal, she had prepared a pot of beef stew with potatoes and carrots, fresh biscuits, and dried apple pie for dessert. The men filed in looking tired and dusty from a day's work, and they stopped short when they saw the table laden with food. "Is this real?" Billy asked, his eyes wide. "Actual food that looks like food?" "It smells like heaven," Juan said reverently. McKenna took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for Zara to sit beside him. "Gentlemen, this is Mrs. Sullivan, our new housekeeper. I expect you to treat her with respect and good manners, or you will answer to me." "Yes, sir," they chorused, and then they fell on the food like starving men. Zara watched them eat, a warm glow of satisfaction spreading through her chest. This was something she knew how to do, something she was good at. Feeding people, caring for them, making a house into a home. It was not the life she had planned, but it was a good life, and she was grateful for it. After dinner, she washed the dishes and cleaned the kitchen, then retreated to her room. She was exhausted, but it was the good kind of exhaustion that came from honest work and a sense of accomplishment. She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed looking at the photograph of Thomas. "I hope you do not mind," she whispered to his image. "I hope you understand that I have to move forward, have to make a new life for myself. I will always love you, but I cannot live in the past forever." The photograph offered no answer, but she felt a sense of peace settle over her nonetheless. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, to find her way in the world. And perhaps here on the Rocking M Ranch she was beginning to do just that. The days turned into weeks, and Zara fell into the rhythm of ranch life. She rose before dawn to start the fire in the stove and prepare breakfast for the hands. After they rode out for the day's work, she cleaned the house, did laundry, tended the kitchen garden that Mrs. Martinez had planted before her accident, and prepared the midday and evening meals. It was hard work but satisfying, and she found herself growing stronger both in body and in spirit. The men treated her with unfailing courtesy and respect, just as McKenna had ordered. But it was more than that. They genuinely seemed to like her, to appreciate the care she put into her work and the warmth she brought to the ranch house. Billy, the youngest, started bringing her wildflowers from the meadow, awkwardly presenting them to her with a shy smile. Juan and Carlos taught her Spanish words while she cooked, laughing good-naturedly when she mangled the pronunciation. Old Tom, the foreman, took to sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, drinking coffee and telling her stories about the early days of the ranch while she mended clothes or rolled out pie dough. And Gabe. Gabe was always nearby, though never intrusive. He seemed to have an instinct for when she needed help, appearing to carry heavy pots or reach high shelves without being asked. They fell into easy conversation, talking about everything and nothing while she worked, and he lingered in the kitchen, ostensibly fixing a piece of tack or cleaning his saddle, but really just keeping her company. Zara found herself looking forward to these moments, to the sound of his voice, and the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. She told herself it was just friendship, just the natural camaraderie that developed between people who lived and worked together. But in her more honest moments, usually late at night when she lay alone in her bed, she admitted to herself that it was becoming something more. It had been 2 months since Thomas died, and she still mourned him, but the sharp edge of her grief had begun to dull, worn smooth by the passage of time and the demands of daily life. She was beginning to remember him with more joy than sorrow, to think of their time together as a blessing rather than a loss. And in that gradual healing, she was discovering that her heart was not as broken as she had thought. It was scarred, yes, but still whole, still capable of feeling warmth and affection and the first tentative stirrings of attraction. One evening in late June, after the hands had finished their supper and dispersed to the bunkhouse or their various tasks, Gabe lingered in the kitchen while Zara washed the dishes. The sun was setting outside the window, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air was soft with the promise of summer. "I have been thinking," Gabe said, his voice casual but his eyes serious. "There is a dance in Kingston this Saturday night. The whole town turns out for it, and it is usually a good time. I was wondering if you might like to go. With me, I mean. If you are not too tired from working all week." Zara's hands stilled in the dishwater, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Are you asking me to accompany you to the dance?" "I am," Gabe said simply. "I know it has not been very long since you lost your husband, and if you are not ready, I understand. But I would very much like to spend the evening with you, away from the ranch and all the work. Just the two of us, enjoying some music and dancing and conversation." Zara turned to face him, drying her hands on her apron. She knew what accepting his invitation would mean, the message it would send to herself, and to him, and to anyone who saw them together. She would be declaring herself ready to move forward, ready to consider the possibility of caring for someone new. It felt momentous and terrifying, and also absolutely right. "I would love to go with you," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Thank you for asking." The smile that spread across Gabe's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Really? That is wonderful. I will borrow the wagon, and we can ride into town together Saturday afternoon. The dance starts at 7, but we could have supper at the hotel restaurant first if you like." "That sounds perfect," Zara said, and she found herself smiling back at him with a warmth that surprised her. The next few days passed in a haze of anticipation and nervous excitement. Zara found herself thinking about the dance at odd moments, wondering what she would wear and how the evening would unfold. She had not been to a social gathering since Thomas's funeral, and the prospect of music and laughter and light-hearted company was both thrilling and slightly daunting. On Saturday afternoon, she put on her best dress, a soft green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her hair up in a more elaborate style than usual, leaving a few tendrils loose to frame her face. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who was beginning to come back to life, whose eyes held not just sorrow, but also hope. Gabe was waiting by the wagon when she emerged from the house, and the look on his face when he saw her made her cheeks flush with pleasure. He had cleaned up too, trading his work clothes for dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie, his hair still damp from washing and combed back from his face. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. The ride into Kingston was filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. They talked about the ranch, about the weather, about inconsequential things that nonetheless felt important because they were sharing them. When they reached town, Gabe drove the wagon to the livery and helped Zara down, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. They had supper at the hotel restaurant, a modest but well-prepared meal of roast beef and potatoes. Other diners glanced at them curiously, and Zara knew that by Monday morning the whole town would know that the widow Sullivan was stepping out with Gabe Zimmerman from the Rocking M. She found that she did not care. Let them talk. She had earned the right to find happiness wherever she could. The dance was held in the town hall, a large room with a raised platform at one end for the musicians. By the time Gabe and Zara arrived, the hall was already filling with people, ranchers, and townspeople dressed in their Saturday best. The musicians were tuning their instruments, and the air buzzed with anticipation and laughter. Mrs. Henderson spotted Zara almost immediately and hurried over, her face bright with approval. "Zara, my dear, how wonderful to see you looking so well. And this must be Mr. Zimmerman. I have heard good things about you, young man." "Thank you, madam," Gabe said with a slight bow. "It is a pleasure to meet you." "Take good care of her," Mrs. Henderson said, patting his arm. "She deserves some happiness after all she has been through." As the evening wore on, Zara found herself swept up in the music and movement. Gabe was a good dancer, confident and sure-footed, and he guided her through reels and waltzes with an ease that made her feel graceful and light. Between dances, they stood at the edge of the hall with cups of punch, watching the swirl of color and motion and talking about everything and nothing. It was during a slower waltz, when Gabe held her close and they moved together in perfect synchronization, that Zara felt something shift inside her. His hand was warm at her waist, his other hand clasping hers, and his eyes looked down at her with such open affection that it made her breath catch. In that moment, with the music swelling around them and the world reduced to just the two of them, she realized that what she felt was no longer just friendship or gratitude or tentative attraction. She was falling in love with Gabe Zimmerman. The realization should have frightened her, coming as it did so soon after losing Thomas, but instead it filled her with a quiet joy, a sense that life was offering her a second chance and she would be a fool not to take it. Love did not diminish love. What she had felt for Thomas was real and precious, and it would always be a part of her. But her heart had more room than she had thought, and Gabe had found his way into it with his quiet kindness and his steady presence, and his clear gray-green eyes that looked at her as though she were something precious. When the waltz ended, Gabe did not immediately release her. They stood together on the dance floor, oblivious to the other couples around them, and he searched her face as though trying to read her thoughts. "Zara," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. I have been trying to find the right time, but I do not think there is a right time for this kind of thing. I care about you. More than I should, probably, given how recently you lost your husband. But I cannot help how I feel, and I will not lie to you about it." Zara felt her eyes fill with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I care about you too, Gabe. I did not think I would feel this way again so soon, but you have been so kind to me, so good to me, and somewhere along the way I started to fall in love with you. I am not sure when it happened, but it did, and I do not want to fight it anymore." Gabe's face lit up with a joy so pure and unguarded that it took her breath away. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that love. I promise you that, Zara. I will take care of you and cherish you and never give you cause to regret choosing me." "I know you will," Zara said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They left the dance shortly after, both of them eager to be alone together without the eyes of the town watching their every move. Gabe drove the wagon out of Kingston and found a quiet spot overlooking the valley, where the stars spread out above them like diamonds scattered on black velvet. They sat together on the wagon seat, Gabe's arm around Zara's shoulders and her head resting against his chest, listening to the night sounds and feeling the gentle breeze on their faces. "I want to court you properly," Gabe said into the quiet darkness. "I know we work together and live on the same ranch, so it is not exactly traditional, but I want to do this right. I want to take you on buggy rides and bring you flowers and write you letters, all the things a man should do when he's trying to win a woman's heart." "You have already won my heart," Zara said with a soft laugh. "But I would love for you to court me anyway. We have time, Gabe. We do not have to rush anything." "Time?" Gabe repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes, we have time. I like the sound of that." They returned to the ranch late that night, and Gabe walked Zara to the door of the ranch house. For a moment they stood together in the darkness, neither quite ready to say goodnight. Then Gabe cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that tasted of promise and new beginnings. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Sweet dreams, Zara Sullivan," he murmured. "Sweet dreams, Gabe Zimmerman," she replied, and slipped inside with her heart singing. The summer passed in a golden haze of work and courtship. Gabe was true to his word, courting Zara with an old-fashioned determination that both amused and touched her. He brought her wild flowers from the meadow, bouquets of lupine and Indian paintbrush that she arranged in jars and placed around the ranch house. He carved her a little wooden box to keep her hairpins in, the lid decorated with her initials in careful script. On Sunday afternoons, when the ranch work slowed down, he borrowed the wagon and took her on long drives through the countryside, showing her places he had discovered during his years working the rocking M. They talked endlessly during those drives, sharing their histories and their dreams. Gabe told her about growing up in Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a family that had barely scraped by after his father died when he was 10. He had left home at 16 to make his own way, working his way north and west until he landed at the Rocking M 5 years ago. McKenna had taken a chance on him when he was green and inexperienced, and he had repaid that faith by becoming one of the best hands on the ranch. Zara told him about her own childhood in California, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had died when she was 15. Her mother had passed 2 years later, leaving Zara alone in the world until Thomas Sullivan had come into her life. She had thought Thomas was her second chance, her opportunity to build a family and a home. And he had been for a while. But now she understood that life sometimes gave you more than a second chance. Sometimes it gave you a third or a fourth, as many as you needed to find your way to happiness. By the time autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and amber, Zara and Gabe had become inseparable. Everyone on the ranch could see how they felt about each other, and they made no secret of it. McKenna, observing them with the wisdom of a man who had lived long and seen much, told Zara one evening that he had never seen Gabe so happy or so settled. "That boy has been drifting ever since I met him," McKenna said, sitting at the kitchen table while Zara kneaded bread dough. "He is a fine worker and a good man, but there was always something restless about him, like he was looking for something he could not quite name. But since you came here, that restlessness has gone. You have given him an anchor, Zara, and I am grateful for that." "He has given me one too," Zara replied softly. "I did not know if I would ever feel whole again after Thomas died, but Gabe makes me feel like myself again, like I am more than just my grief and my loss." "That is what love does, when it is the right kind of love," McKenna said. "It does not erase the past, but it gives you a reason to look toward the future." In October, on a crisp, clear day when the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, Gabe asked Zara to marry him. They were sitting by the creek, having ridden out together to check on a section of fence that needed mending. The water burbled over smooth stones, and the cottonwoods rustled overhead, their golden leaves shimmering in the breeze. Gabe took her hand in his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Zara Sullivan, I have loved you since the day you stepped into that alley and faced down those men to help me. I have loved you more with every day that has passed since then. I know you have been married before, and I know that losing Thomas still hurts. I am not trying to replace him or make you forget him, but I am asking you to build a new life with me, to be my wife and my partner and the mother of my children, if we are blessed with them. Will you marry me?" Zara felt tears stream down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Gabe, I will marry you. I love you so much, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else." Gabe pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in the center. "It was my mother's," he said, as he slipped it onto her finger. "It is not much, but it is the most precious thing I own, and I want you to have it." "It is perfect," Zara whispered, looking down at the ring glinting on her finger. "Everything is perfect." They were married in November, in a small ceremony at the church in Kingston. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Cooper stood up as witnesses, along with McKenna and Tom, the ranch foreman. The other hands from the Rocking M attended, scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best, grinning like fools as Gabe and Zara exchanged their vows. Zara wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming roses from Mrs. Cooper's garden. Gabe wore a new suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and when he looked at her standing beside him at the altar, his eyes shone with such love and pride that it made her heart overflow. "I, Gabriel Zimmerman, take you, Zara Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice strong and clear. "I promise to love you and cherish you, to stand by you in good times and bad, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live. I, Zara Sullivan, take you, Gabriel Zimmerman, to be my lawfully wedded husband," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I promise to love you and cherish you, to stand by you in good times and bad, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Gabe he could kiss his bride, Gabe cupped Zara's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget they were standing in a church full of people. In that moment, there was only the two of them, joined together in a bond that nothing could break. The reception was held at the ranch with tables set up outside under the autumn sky. The hands had spent all morning roasting a steer and preparing side dishes, and there was enough food to feed an army. McKenna gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry at the same time, talking about how Gabe had found not just a wife, but also a home, and how Zara had found not just a husband, but also a family. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the yard, Gabe and Zara danced together to the music of a fiddle and a guitar played by two of the hands. They moved together as though they had been dancing together their whole lives, perfectly in sync, perfectly matched. And when the music ended and the guests began to drift away, Gabe swept Zara up in his arms and carried her into the ranch house, to the room that was now theirs to begin their new life together. Their first year of marriage was filled with the quiet joys of building a life together. McKenna gave them a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, a sturdy two-room structure with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. Gabe and Zara spent their spare time fixing it up, painting the walls and sewing curtains and building furniture from rough-cut lumber. It was not much, but it was theirs, and they loved it with a fierce pride. Zara continued to work as the housekeeper at the main ranch house during the day, but now she came home each evening to her own hearth and her own husband. They took their meals together, sitting at the small table Gabe had built, talking about their day and making plans for the future. At night, they lay in their bed with the firelight flickering on the walls, wrapped in each other's arms, and Zara marveled at how completely her life had changed in the space of a single year. In the spring of 1884, Zara discovered she was expecting a child. The realization filled her with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She had wanted children with Thomas, but they had not been blessed before he died. Now, carrying Gabe's child, she felt as though she was being given another chance, another opportunity to create the family she had always dreamed of. Gabe was overjoyed when she told him, his face lighting up with such pure happiness that it brought tears to her eyes. He became even more protective of her than usual, insisting that she not lift anything heavy or work too hard. McKenna, hearing the news, immediately hired a girl from town to help with the housework, giving Zara more time to rest and prepare for the baby. The pregnancy was not easy. Zara suffered from terrible nausea in the early months, and as she grew larger, she found herself exhausted by even simple tasks. But Gabe was there every step of the way, holding her hair back when she was sick, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings, reading aloud to her from books borrowed from McKenna's library while she rested on the sofa. In November, as the first snow began to fall on the mountains, Zara went into labor. Mrs. Henderson and the doctor from Kingston came out to the ranch, and Gabe paced the floor of the main ranch house while the women attended to Zara in the bedroom. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following morning. But finally, as the sun rose over the valley, the sharp cry of a newborn baby rang through the house. Gabe burst into the room to find Zara propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. Mrs. Henderson stood beside the bed, beaming, and the doctor was washing his hands at the washstand. "You have a son," Zara said, her voice hoarse but filled with wonder. "Gabe, we have a son." Gabe crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, looking down at the tiny red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes were squeezed shut, his little fists waving in the air. Gabe reached out one finger, and the baby grasped it with surprising strength. And in that moment, Gabe felt his heart expand with a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took his breath away. "He is perfect," Gabe whispered. "Zara, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel, after Gabe's father, and he became the center of their world. Zara recovered slowly from the difficult birth, but with Gabe's constant care and attention, she grew stronger each day. They moved back to their cabin when she was well enough, and Gabe built a cradle for Daniel that he placed beside their bed so they could hear every sound the baby made. The winter passed in a haze of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Daniel grew rapidly, filling out from the scrawny newborn into a plump, healthy baby with Gabe's eyes and Zara's dark hair. McKenna and the ranch hands doted on him, taking turns holding him and making ridiculous faces to coax out his first smiles. By the time spring arrived again, Daniel was crawling and pulling himself up on furniture, and Zara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She had a husband who loved her without reservation, a child who brought joy to every moment, and a home that was truly hers. The grief she had carried for Thomas had softened into a bittersweet memory, something she could look back on with gratitude rather than pain. One evening in April, as she and Gabe sat on the porch of their cabin watching Daniel toddle around the yard under the watchful eye of old Tom, Zara reached over and took Gabe's hand. "I never thought I could be this happy," she said softly. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I would never have a family or a home again. But you gave me all of that, Gabe. You took me in without question, without judgment, and you loved me back to life." "You did the same for me," Gabe replied, squeezing her hand. "I was just drifting before I met you, going through the motions, but never really living. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. You gave me a family, Zara. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They sat together in the fading light, watching their son play and listening to the evening sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. In the distance, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, and the air smelled of sage and new grass. The years that followed were good ones. Daniel grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. By the time he was 3, he could sit on a horse in front of Gabe and ride around the property, his laughter ringing out across the valley. 2 years after Daniel was born, Zara gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, who had Gabe's blonde hair and Zara's green eyes. And 3 years after Rose came another son, Michael, who was the spitting image of his father. The cabin that had seemed spacious when it was just Gabe and Zara quickly became too small for their growing family. With McKenna's blessing and the help of the ranch hands, Gabe built a larger house on the same spot, a proper 4-bedroom house with a wide porch and a kitchen big enough for Zara to cook for her family and the hands who often stopped by for a meal. Zara no longer worked as the housekeeper at the main ranch house. McKenna had hired someone else for that position, freeing Zara to focus on her own home and children. But she still helped out during busy times, cooking for roundup crews or lending a hand when McKenna hosted gatherings. And she remained close friends with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Cooper, visiting them in town whenever she could and hosting them at the ranch for Sunday dinners. Life was not without its challenges. There were years when drought threatened the cattle and money was tight. There were illnesses and injuries like the time Daniel broke his arm falling from a tree, or the winter when Rose came down with pneumonia and they feared they might lose her. There were the ordinary struggles of raising children and running a household and making ends meet. But through it all, Zara and Gabe stood together, their love for each other deepening with each passing year. They had built something solid and lasting, a family and a home that could weather any storm. And on quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep and they sat together on the porch watching the stars come out, Zara often thought back to that terrible day when Walter Sullivan had turned her out after the funeral, and how lost and frightened she had been. She thought about the cowboy who had carried her trunk up the steps of the boarding house, who had offered his help without question or expectation of reward. She thought about how he had seen something in her that she had not seen in herself, a strength and resilience that had carried her through the darkest time of her life. And she thought about how love, real and enduring love, could heal even the deepest wounds and create something beautiful from the ashes of loss. "What are you thinking about?" Gabe asked, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. "Just how lucky I am," Zara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "How lucky we are." "The luckiest," Gabe agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. By the time Daniel was 15, he was already working alongside his father on the ranch, learning everything there was to know about cattle and horses and the land. Rose, at 12, was clever and quick-witted, with dreams of becoming a teacher. And Michael, at 9, was the family's comedian, always getting into mischief and making everyone laugh with his antics. McKenna had grown old, his hair completely white now, and his movements slower than they used to be. But his mind was as sharp as ever, and he took great pleasure in watching the Zimmerman family flourish on his land. He had made Gabe his foreman years earlier, and there was an unspoken understanding that when McKenna passed on, the ranch would go to Gabe. It was only fitting. Gabe had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into the rocking M, and he loved it as much as McKenna did. One evening in late summer of 1899, McKenna called Gabe and Zara to the main ranch house. He looked tired but peaceful, sitting in his favorite chair by the fireplace even though the evening was warm and no fire burned. "I have been doing some thinking," McKenna said without preamble. "I am not getting any younger, and I need to put my affairs in order. I have no children of my own, no family to leave this place to. But I do have you two, and your children. You are the closest thing to family I have ever had, and I want the rocking M to be yours when I am gone." Zara felt tears prick her eyes. "Mr. McKenna, you do not have to do this." "Yes, I do," McKenna replied firmly. "You two have made this place a home, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who works here. You have raised your children here, built your lives here. It would be wrong for the ranch to go to anyone else." He pulled out a sheaf of papers from the table beside him. "I have had my lawyer draw up the documents. When I pass, the rocking M will belong to Gabriel and Zara Zimmerman, free and clear." Gabe stood and crossed to McKenna's chair, kneeling beside it and taking the old man's hand. "Thank you, Patrick, for everything, for giving me a chance when I was just a kid with nothing to my name, for trusting me and teaching me and treating me like the son you never had. I will take care of this place. I swear it. I will make sure your legacy lives on." "I know you will," McKenna said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are a good man, Gabe Zimmerman, and you, Zara, are a remarkable woman. I am proud to have known you both." McKenna passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months later, on a cool October night when the cottonwoods were ablaze with color. They buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had chosen years before. The entire community turned out for the funeral, ranchers and townspeople alike, all of them paying their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the community for nearly 40 years. Zara stood beside Gabe at the graveside, her hand clasped tightly in his, and thought about how much had changed since that other funeral 16 years earlier. Then she had been alone and afraid, cast out by the man who should have been her family. Now she stood surrounded by people who loved her, a wife and mother and respected member of the community. She had built a life that Thomas would have been proud of, and she had found a love that was just as real and precious as what she had shared with him. As the mourners began to disperse, Gabe turned to her with a serious expression. "We have a ranch to run now. It is a big responsibility." "We can handle it," Zara said confidently. "Together we can handle anything." And she was right. Over the next decade, the Rockingham flourished under Gabe and Zara's management. They expanded the herd, improved the water systems, and built a reputation for raising some of the finest cattle in Nevada. Daniel grew into a strong, capable young man who took on more and more responsibility on the ranch. Rose achieved her dream of becoming a teacher, accepting a position at the school in Kingston. And Michael, following in his father's footsteps, became one of the best horsemen in the territory. By 1910, when Zara was 50 years old and Gabe was 48, they had become the patriarch and matriarch of not just their family, but the entire community. Young couples came to them for advice. Neighboring ranchers consulted with Gabe on cattle breeding and range management. Zara was known throughout the region for her kindness and generosity, always ready with a meal for a hungry traveler or a bed for someone in need. They had also become grandparents. Daniel had married a girl from a neighboring ranch, and they had given Gabe and Zara 2 grandsons and a granddaughter. Rose had married the son of the Kingston doctor, and they had a son of their own. Even Michael, the baby of the family, was courting a girl from town, and there was talk of a wedding in the spring. On a cool evening in November, Zara and Gabe sat together on the porch of their house, wrapped in blankets against the chill. The valley spread out before them, bathed in the golden light of sunset, and in the distance they could see the lights beginning to come on in the bunkhouse and the main ranch house, where Daniel and his family now lived. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Zara asked, not for the first time. It was a conversation they returned to occasionally, usually on quiet evenings like this when they had time to reflect. "All the time," Gabe replied. "If you had not been turned out by your father-in-law, if you had not been in Kingston that day when I needed help, if I had not been brave enough to ask McKenna to hire you, so many things had to happen just right for us to end up here." "I used to think it was just chance, or luck," Zara said thoughtfully. "But now I think it was something more. I think we were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together." "I believe that too," Gabe said, pulling her closer. "And I am grateful every single day that we did. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Zara Zimmerman. You and our children, and the life we have built together." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," Zara replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You took me in when I had nowhere else to go. You loved me when I thought I would never love again. You gave me a family and a home and a future I never dared dream of. I love you, Gabe Zimmerman." "More than I can ever say." "I love you too," Gabe murmured, and kissed her as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. As the years continued to pass, Zara and Gabe settled into the comfortable rhythm of their later years. They watched their children thrive and their grandchildren grow, taking quiet pride in the legacy they had built. The Rockingham remained prosperous, a testament to their hard work and good management. And their love, tested by time and circumstance, proved to be as enduring as the mountains that ringed their valley, On their 30th wedding anniversary in November of 1914, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was filled with laughter and the smell of good food, and after the meal, Daniel stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "you taught us what it means to love truly and work hard and build something that lasts. You showed us that family is not just about blood, but about the people who stand by you through thick and thin. You gave us a home and a legacy, and we are grateful for it every single day. To Gabe and Zara Zimmerman, the best parents anyone could ask for." "To Gabe and Zara," everyone chorused, and the sound of clinking glasses filled the room. Later that evening, when the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Zara and Gabe stood together in the room they had shared for 30 years. Zara looked at the photographs that lined the walls, images of their children at various ages, their wedding day, holidays and birthdays, and ordinary moments that had become extraordinary simply because they had lived them together. "We did it," she said softly. "We built a good life, Gabe, a life worth living." "We did," Gabe agreed, his arm around her waist. "And we are not done yet. We still have years ahead of us. Years to watch our grandchildren grow and maybe even meet some great-grandchildren. Years to sit on that porch and watch the sunset and count our blessings." "I am already counting them," Zara said, turning to face him. "And you are at the top of the list every single time." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of loss and loneliness. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the stars wheeled overhead, eternal and unchanging. But inside, in the warmth of their home and the certainty of their love, Zara and Gabe knew that they had found something just as enduring, something that would outlast them both and live on in the children and grandchildren they had raised together. The story of how a cowboy took in a widow without question, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that transformed two lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations, was one that would be told and retold in the Zimmerman family for years to come. It was a reminder that even in the hardest times, when everything seems lost, hope can be found in unexpected places. That love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes, when you are cast out and alone, a stranger with kind eyes and a generous heart can become your salvation, your partner, and your home. Zara Sullivan had been turned out by her father-in-law after the funeral, with nothing but $50 and a trunk full of memories. Gabriel Zimmerman had taken her in without question, offering his help when she needed it most. And from that simple beginning, they had built a life filled with love and family and the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you have found your place in the world. It was a story of resilience and redemption, of second chances and enduring love, and it was theirs to treasure for the rest of their days.